She didn't cry when the first man laughed at her. She didn't cry when the second turned his back. She didn't even cry when the third one said, out loud, in front of everyone, "I can't marry something like that." She just stood there in the Wyoming dust, her travel bag at her feet, 11 days of hope disintegrating in the afternoon heat, while an entire town decided she was a joke. But here's what Black Hollow didn't know yet. The woman they were laughing at, she was about to become the one person none of them could live without. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit the ruts outside Black Hollow just after 2 in the afternoon, and Margaret Holloway braced herself against the wooden seat the way she had braced herself against most things in her life, quietly, without complaint, and with both hands gripping something solid. 11 days. 11 days since she had left the only life she had ever known in Cheyenne, the cramped boarding house, the laundry work that had turned her hands raw and red, the landlady who charged double and smiled half as much. 11 days of dust roads, creek crossings, and sleeping upright in a coach that smelled of leather and other people's anxieties. She had spent those 11 days with a stack of letters folded carefully in the front pocket of her traveling bag. 3 letters from 3 different men. Each one had responded to her notice in the Wyoming Frontier Matrimonial Gazette, a notice she had written and rewritten 7 times before submitting, careful to be honest about herself, honest about what she was looking for, honest in the way that had always cost her more than it should have. She had told them she was 28 years old. She had told them she was a capable cook and a hard worker. She had told them she had no family left to speak of. And she had told them, plainly and without apology, that she was a large woman, not small in any direction. A woman who had grown up eating bread and potato soup, who had inherited her grandmother's broad shoulders and her mother's wide hips, and who had made her peace with the body she lived in a long time ago. 2 of the 3 men had written back warmly. The third had written back eagerly. She had believed them. That was the thing about hope. It didn't ask your permission before it moved in and rearranged the furniture. The town of Black Hollow materialized through the coach window as a collection of wooden storefronts lining a single long street, with side roads bleeding off into farms and pasture land. A water tower, a general store, a church with a bell that needed painting, a saloon from which piano music drifted into the afternoon air like smoke. It was smaller than she had imagined and rougher, but Margaret Holloway had not come to Black Hollow looking for elegance. She had come looking for purpose, for a piece of ground she could stand on and call hers, for a family maybe, if she was lucky. Real luck, the quiet kind that didn't announce itself. The coach lurched to a stop in front of the express office, and the driver called down from the box. "Black Hollow, end of line!" Margaret gathered her bag and her hat and stepped down onto the street. 3 men were waiting. She saw them before they saw her clearly. They were standing in a loose cluster near the hitching post, squinting against the afternoon glare. She recognized them by their descriptions, the ones they had written about themselves in letters. Thomas Aldridge, the wheat farmer. Tall, narrow-shouldered, with a sun-reddened neck and a hat pushed back on his head. 41 years old. 2 children, grown and gone. Harold Pruitt, the mill owner. Shorter, heavier himself, with a thick red beard and suspenders that strained across his chest. 45. Widower. And James Cooley, the youngest of the 3 at 36, a cattle broker with dark hair and a new coat that still had the store creases in the sleeves, the one who had written her 4 letters instead of 2, each one warmer than the last. She walked toward them. The moment she stepped fully into the light, she watched something happen across all 3 faces simultaneously. A rapid, involuntary recalibration. Eyes moving up and down, mouths shifting, the particular expression of a man revising his expectations in real time and not bothering to hide it. She had seen that expression before. She had been seeing it her entire life. She kept walking. Thomas Aldridge recovered first. He pulled his hat from his head and held it in both hands, which might have looked polite if his expression had not been the expression of a man who had just discovered a horse he bid on was missing a leg. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I'm Thomas Aldridge." "Mr. Aldridge," she said, and extended her hand. "It's good to put a face to the letters." He shook it briefly, barely, the handshake of a man already forming an exit. Harold Pruitt said nothing at all. He simply stared at her for a long moment, not with cruelty exactly, but with the open, unfiltered blankness of a man who has forgotten to wear a social face. Then he cleared his throat and looked sideways at the saloon. James Cooley. James, who had written, "I look forward to building something real with a woman of honest character." James took one full step backward. One step. Small. But Margaret saw it. She always saw it. "Well," James said. He turned his coat lapel in his fingers. "Well, you did say, you mentioned you wrote that you were a larger woman." "I did," Margaret said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Yes, you did mention that." A silence fell over the small group, not a peaceful silence, the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses down on the top of a person's head. Thomas Aldridge broke it. "I don't think," he said carefully, "that this is going to work for me, Miss Holloway. I apologize for your trouble." He put his hat back on and turned away without another word. Just like that. 11 days of travel, a train ticket, and a coach fare she had saved 8 months to afford, and he was already walking back toward the wheat fields that did not need her. Harold Pruitt at least had the decency, or perhaps the cowardice, to not speak at all. He simply turned to follow Aldridge, his red beard hiding whatever his mouth was doing, his footsteps raising small puffs of dust, which left James Cooley. James Cooley, who had written 4 letters. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working something out behind his eyes, some calculation or argument with himself, and for just a moment she genuinely thought, that he might be different. He wasn't. "I'm sorry," James said. And then he said the part she would not forget for a long time, the part that drove itself into the soft place behind her sternum like a nail. "I'm sorry, but I have a reputation in this valley, and I can't afford to be seen with a woman who looks—" He stopped, started again. "It's nothing personal." "It is entirely personal, Mr. Cooley," Margaret said quietly. "But you go ahead." He went ahead. She was left standing in the street. In any town, in any time, the disappearance of 3 men from the front of the express office within 5 minutes of a stagecoach arrival does not go unnoticed. By the time Margaret turned back to collect her bag from beside the coach wheel, there were already a dozen people watching from doorways, from under porch awnings, from across the street. She heard a laugh, sharp, male, belonging to someone she could not immediately identify. She heard someone say, just loud enough to carry, "There's that mail-order bride nobody wanted." She heard a woman's voice then, softer, but not soft enough. Poor thing, did she really think any man out here would want? Well, you can see why they turned her down. Margaret set her bag down on the boardwalk in front of the express office. She sat down beside it on the wooden step. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not cry. She had a long history of not crying in public, built up over 28 years of practice. Crying in public was something she had done exactly once, at age 9, when her schoolmates in Cheyenne had refused to let her play with them at recess. And even then she had waited until she was behind the school building, out of sight. She was not behind a building now. She was fully visible to an entire town that seemed to have arranged itself, like an audience, to watch what she would do next. So she sat, and she thought, and she calculated. She had $7.30 left in the bottom of her bag. The return coach wouldn't come through for another week. A week of lodging at Black Hollow's only hotel would cost her $4. The hotel meal service would cost another $2, which would leave her with $1.30 to figure out the rest of her life. She was doing the arithmetic on her fingers, quietly, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up. The man standing in front of her was not one of the 3 who had walked away. She was certain of that. She had studied their descriptions enough times to recognize them from a distance. This man was different, taller, leaner in the way of a person who worked hard and often. His face was weathered in the particular manner of outdoor life, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested both sun and something heavier. He held his hat in his hand. His shirt had been mended at the left elbow, and his boots were working boots, not town boots. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes the particular gray-green of river water in late autumn. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize, because it was not the expression she was accustomed to receiving. It was not pity. It was not mockery. It was not that flat, reflexive assessment she had been watching men perform on her all afternoon. It was, she realized after a moment, simply attention. the focused, serious attention of someone trying to understand a situation accurately. "Miss Holloway," he said. "That's right," she said, "though I'm not sure how you know my name." "Small town," he said. "Word travels." He paused. "I'm Cole Bennett. I have a ranch about 4 miles out on the North Road." "Congratulations," she said, because she was tired, and her manners had temporarily excused themselves. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "I wasn't one of the men who wrote to you," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Clearly noted. But I heard what happened, and I have a situation of my own." He paused again, and she could tell he was a man who did not speak carelessly. Every word seemed to cost him something. "My wife passed 14 months ago. I have 2 children. A daughter, she's 7, Sadie. A son, Eli, he's 12. The ranch it needs work, and the children need someone. I need help I can trust." He cleared his throat. "I know this isn't the offer you came here for, but I'm offering it." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the town was watching. She could feel it. The particular quality of being observed, which she knew better than most. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Bennett?" she asked, "because I want to be precise about this before either of us says another word." "A home," he said. "Work that matters. Fair treatment, time, and the possibility of something more, if that's something you'd be willing to consider. In time." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to make you promises I can't keep, but I'll tell you what I can promise. I won't laugh at you. I won't walk away." The afternoon sun was still bright, and the town was still watching, and her feet hurt from 11 days of travel, and she had $7.30 and no plan. She looked at Cole Bennett, at his mended sleeve and his river-colored eyes and his expression that asked her nothing except whether she was willing to try. 4 miles north, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the children? Do they know you were considering this?" A pause. "They know I've been thinking about a change." "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She stood up from the step, picked up her bag, settled her hat. "Then we'd better go explain it to them," she said. "And Mr. Bennett, if any one of them asks me to leave, I will. I won't stay where I'm not welcome. I think you should know that about me from the start." He looked at her for a moment, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth completed itself. It was, in fact, a small smile, tired and real. "Fair enough," he said, and reached for her bag. She didn't let him take it. She carried it herself, as she always had, and walked beside him to the wagon, while the town of Black Hollow watched in silence and tried to decide what exactly it had just witnessed. The road north was quiet. Cole drove the wagon, and Margaret sat on the bench beside him, and for the first mile, neither of them said very much. The land opened up around them. Wyoming grassland in high summer, the kind of landscape that insisted on its own importance, massive and indifferent and strangely beautiful in the way that only wild things are. The mountains were blue at the edge of the sky. A hawk circled something in a distant field. "The men who walked away," Cole said finally. "You knew them only from letters?" "Only from letters," she confirmed. "And you came anyway." 11 days. "I came for a life," she said simply. "The men were the means to that end, not the end itself." He considered this for a moment. "That's an unusual way to think about it." "Is it?" "I found it's the only practical way. You can't build a life on a man you haven't met. You can only build it on the work you're willing to do when you get there." He drove in silence for another quarter mile. "The town will talk," he said. "About you being out at my ranch. They'll talk anyway after what happened today." "Let them," she said. "I've been talked about before. The talking never actually hurt me. The only things that have ever hurt me are the things I let stop me." He glanced at her sideways. "What did you do in Cheyenne?" "Laundry work, mostly. I kept accounts for a hardware merchant for 2 years. I taught reading to 3 children in my neighborhood when their school burned down. I made myself useful wherever I could find a way to be useful." "Accounts," he said. "You can do numbers?" "I'm better at numbers than most men I've met," she said. "I don't say that to be difficult. It's just the truth." He nodded slowly. Something in the way he nodded suggested this information was being filed rather than dismissed. The Bennett Ranch appeared around a long bend in the road, and Margaret's first impression was that it was a place that had once been cared for deeply and was currently being held together by memory and determination alone. The house was solid, 2 stories, good timber, a porch that wrapped around the front and left side. But the porch railing had come loose in 3 places. The kitchen garden was overgrown, the beds barely visible under a season's worth of weeds. A fence along the near pasture had posts leaning at tired angles. The barn was sound, from what she could see, but the yard between house and barn was scattered with things that had been set down and not picked back up. It was the look of a place where someone had stopped mid-sentence, where life had interrupted itself and not yet resumed. She recognized it. She had seen it in people, too, that mid-sentence quality, that particular unfinished grief. 2 figures appeared on the porch as the wagon rolled into the yard. The girl, Sadie, was small for 7, with her father's dark hair and the large, serious eyes of a child who has learned to watch the world carefully. She gripped the porch post and watched the wagon approach with an expression that mixed wariness with something that might, very tentatively, be curiosity. The boy, Eli, stood behind her. 12 years old, already with his father's height promising itself in his frame. His arms were crossed, his jaw was set. He had the particular posture of someone who had decided, in advance, how he felt about this. Cole set the brake and climbed down. He lifted a hand to the children. "This is Miss Holloway," he said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while and helping out around the place." Sadie's eyes moved to Margaret, traveling up, then down. With the frank assessment only children and very honest adults permit themselves. "You're really big," Sadie said. "Sadie," Cole said. "I know," Margaret said easily. "I take up a good amount of space. It's never bothered me much." She looked at the girl steadily. "What's your name?" "You already know it. Papa said it." "I'd like to hear you say it." A pause. The wariness shifted slightly. "Sadie." "Sadie?" Margaret repeated. "I like it. It fits you." She looked up at the boy. "And you're Eli." He said nothing. "You don't have to like this," she said, directly, clearly, without softening it into something untrue. "You don't have to be happy about it. I'm not going to ask you to pretend. But I'm going to do the work that needs doing here, and I'm not going to get in your way, and I'm not going to ask you for anything you're not ready to give." Eli looked at her for a long moment. His jaw stayed set, but something in his eyes, some small thing, shifted just slightly. The way a door shifts when the wind changes without opening, he went back inside without a word. Sadie watched him go, then she looked back at Margaret. "He's always like that now," she said, "since Mama died." "I know," Margaret said. How do you know? You just got here." "Because grief does the same things to people regardless of where they are," Margaret said. "It's one of the few fair things about it." Sadie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can you cook?" she asked finally. "I can." "Papa's cooking is terrible." "Sadie," Cole said. "It is, Papa. It's been terrible for a year." Margaret looked at Cole, who had the expression of a man who knows a thing is true and wishes it weren't being said out loud. "Why don't you show me the kitchen?" Margaret said to Sadie, "and we can start there." The kitchen was, as she had suspected from the state of the yard, a reflection of the last 14 months. Not dirty. Cole Bennett was clearly not a man who tolerated genuine filth, but stripped down, functional in the barest possible sense, the way a kitchen looks when it is being used for survival rather than lived in. There were no herbs hung to dry. The window box was empty. The table had only 3 chairs pushed up to it. Someone had removed the 4th at some point and never brought it back. She noticed all of this without commenting on it. She set down her bag and took off her jacket and asked Sadie where the flour was kept, and Sadie led her to the pantry with the gravity of a person conducting an important tour, and Margaret took inventory of what they had to work with. That first evening, she made biscuits and a soup from salt pork and dried beans, and the few vegetables she found still growing at the edge of the neglected garden, green onions, some sad but salvageable carrots, a handful of herbs gone wild but still fragrant. She did it without fuss, without announcement, without asking for help. She simply worked. When she set supper on the table, Sadie sat down immediately. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the food, and sat down too, though he kept his eyes on the table. Cole said, This is a real meal. It's just soup and biscuits, Margaret said. It's the first real meal we've had in a while, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not about food at all. They ate. Nobody talked very much, which was fine. Some meals are about more than conversation. Some meals are just about sitting together in the same room, breathing the same air, being present in the same moment. And that Margaret understood was enough for a first night. After supper, Sadie helped her clear the dishes without being asked. While they stood at the basin, the girl said quietly, almost to herself, Mama used to make biscuits too. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What did her biscuits taste like? Sadie thought about it. Like butter. And warm. And like everything was okay. That's the best thing biscuits can taste like, Margaret said. Sadie looked up at her with those serious dark eyes. Yours tastes like that too. A little bit. And that small, unasked-for thing was the first real thing that happened at the Bennett Ranch. The first real thing that had nothing to do with rejection or mockery or the watching eyes of a town that had already made up its mind. It was not much, but it was something to build on. And Margaret Holloway, who had spent her entire life building on small things, knew exactly what to do with it. Outside in the dark, 4 miles south, the town of Black Hollow was still talking. They were saying she wouldn't last a week. They were saying Cole Bennett had made a fool's bargain. They were saying the woman nobody wanted was exactly that, and nothing more. They had not yet learned the cost of underestimating a woman who had run out of things to fear. The first week passed. The way first weeks always do in a new place. In the particular exhaustion of learning where everything is kept, who needs what, and which silences mean peace, and which ones mean something is wrong. Margaret woke before dawn every morning, not because anyone asked her to, and not to make a point. She woke early because that was simply what the work required, and she had never been a woman who required the work to meet her halfway. The kitchen was her first real project, not the cooking she had started the first night, but the kitchen itself, which had the feel of a room that had been walked through rather than lived in for over a year. She found the fourth chair pushed to the back of the storage room, covered with a canvas cloth, and she carried it back to the table and set it in its place without comment. She found dried herbs in a tin on the high shelf, forgotten under a layer of dust, and she brought them back into use. She scrubbed the walls above the stove, where grease had built up in thin amber layers, and she repaired the hinge on the pantry door with a screwdriver she found hanging on a nail in the barn. Small things. But a house is made of small things. Cole watched her work with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to trust improvements too quickly. He was polite. He was consistent. He did what he said he was going to do, arrived when he said he would arrive, and treated her with a steady, quiet respect that she appreciated more than she could easily have explained. But there was a distance in him. Not unkindness, nothing so simple as that. It was more like a man who has learned to hold himself at a slight remove from everything, because the last time he stopped doing that, something inside him broke. She did not push against that distance. She understood it better than he probably knew. Sadie was easier, children often are, when they are given the room to be honest. Within 3 days, the girl had appointed herself Margaret's unofficial assistant in all kitchen matters, appearing at her elbow each morning with the solemn readiness of someone reporting for duty. She had opinions about everything, about which bowl was better for mixing biscuit dough, about the proper number of minutes an egg should be boiled, about the way the morning light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle that Sadie had decided was her favorite thing about the whole house. "Mama used to stand right there," Sadie said one morning, pointing to the spot beside the stove where Margaret was currently standing, stirring oats. Right in that exact spot. She said it was the warmest place in the whole house in the winter. She had good instincts, Margaret said. She was really pretty, Sadie said. Then, with the devastating directness of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to protect people from true things. "You're not pretty like she was, but I think I like you anyway." "That is one of the nicest things anyone has said to me in a long time," Margaret said, and meant it completely. Eli was the harder work. He was not cruel. She wanted to be precise about that, because cruelty would have been, in a strange way, easier to navigate. Cruelty had a shape. It had edges. You could find the edge and decide what to do about it. Eli's resistance was something different. It was a wall with no door in it, no window, no seam to look through. He appeared at meals and disappeared after them. He did his chores without being asked because he was that kind of boy, responsible in his bones, the way some children are. But he did not speak to Margaret unless speaking was strictly necessary, and even then his words were minimal, precise, and delivered to some middle point in the air between them rather than directly to her face. She did not take it personally. Or rather, she took it personally in the correct way, which was to understand that it was, in fact, personal, but personal to his grief rather than to her specifically. She was a newcomer to a wound that had been forming for 14 months. She could not expect to step into the center of that wound and be welcomed. So she gave him space, she gave him time, and she paid attention the way she paid attention to everything, quietly, without making her attention felt. What she noticed, Eli went to the barn every evening after supper. He stayed there for 30 or 40 minutes, always alone. Once, passing by with a bucket of kitchen scraps for the compost heap, she heard him talking inside. A low, continuous murmur, too quiet to make out words. She kept walking. She didn't look in. The next evening, she set a plate of molasses cookies on the fence post closest to the barn door before she went to bed. In the morning, the plate was empty. She said nothing about it. She simply made more cookies 2 days later. This was how she had always worked her way into the confidence of closed things. Not by forcing, not by demanding, by making herself consistently present and consistently safe until the closed thing decided for itself whether to open. The ranch itself was a more straightforward problem than the children, in the sense that a fence post does not have feelings about being repaired. On the fourth day, while Cole was out in the far pasture, Margaret walked the entire perimeter of the property with a notepad she had found in the desk in the front room. She made a list. The broken fence sections, 7 of them, spread across the north and west boundaries. The kitchen garden, which could be restored to productivity within a season with the right work. The chicken coop, which was structurally sound but needed new wire along the south face where something had been testing it. The porch railing, the pump handle, which stuck on the upstroke and would stick worse when winter came. The root cellar door, which had swollen and no longer seated properly in its frame. She brought the list to Cole that evening after supper, when the children had gone up to bed. He looked at it for a long time. Something moved across his face, an expression she could not entirely read, something between gratitude and pain. "I've been meaning to get to all of this," he said. "I know you have," she said. "You've been keeping the animals alive and the children fed and the debt from eating you whole. There's only so much one person can hold at once." He set the list on the table. "Some of these things cost money I don't have right now." "Some of them," she agreed. "The porch railing doesn't. The chicken wire, do you have any left in the barn?" "Some." "Then that one doesn't either. The pump handle needs a part, but it's a small part, and I can ride to town for it. The root cellar door just needs planing, an hour's work if there's a hand plane in the barn." "There is," he said slowly. "Then we start with what costs nothing," she said, "and we make a plan for the rest." He looked at her across the table, that steady, assessing look she had begun to recognize as his version of paying close attention. "Where did you learn to think like that?" "Necessity," she said. "When you've never had much money, you learn to treat time and effort the same way some people treat money. You learn to spend them where they do the most good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret." It was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it. "The men in town, Aldridge, Pruitt, Cooley, they're going to keep talking. People are going to see you riding for supplies, and there's going to be more talk." "There is," she agreed. "It doesn't bother you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "It bothers me the way weather bothers me," she said at last. "It's unpleasant when it's happening, but I've never once managed to stop the weather by being upset about it. So I carry an umbrella and I keep moving." He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed, not a large laugh, a small one, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who has forgotten that something can strike him as genuinely funny. It lasted only a moment, but it changed his face completely, the way sun changes a room. He caught himself, cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "We start tomorrow on the fence." "We start tonight on the porch railing," she said. "There's still an hour of light." He looked at her again. Then he pushed back his chair and stood up. "I'll get the tools," he said. They worked side by side on the porch railing as the Wyoming sky went through its extravagant sunset. Orange first, then deep red, then the particular shade of purple that only exists for about 4 minutes before dark takes over completely. Sadie came out in her nightgown to watch for a while, sitting on the top porch step with her chin in her hands. Eli stood in the upstairs window for a moment, looking down, before the curtain fell back into place. Margaret did not comment on this, but she noted it. The second week brought something she had not anticipated. The town came to the ranch. Not in any friendly sense. It was Martha Bellows first, the wife of the hardware merchant, who arrived with a jar of preserved peaches and the specific energy of a woman who has come to collect information rather than deliver food. She sat in the front room with her sharp eyes moving over every surface, and she said to Cole, with Margaret present in the room, "How is your arrangement working out?" in a tone that made the word arrangement carry more weight than it had any right to. "It's working out fine," Cole said. Martha Bellows looked at Margaret with the evaluating gaze of a woman who has already decided what she's evaluating and is simply confirming it. "I'm sure it must be a relief," she said to Cole, "having help." "It is," Cole said. Margaret poured tea and said nothing and smiled pleasantly and gave Martha Bellows nothing at all to carry back to town except the image of a woman who was unbothered and in her own kitchen. After Martha left, Sadie appeared in the doorway. "I don't like her," Sadie announced. "Sadie," Cole said. She looked at Margaret like Margaret was a thing, not a person. "She did," Margaret said. "Some people do that. It doesn't mean they're right. Does it make you sad?" Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes," she said, "but not for long. I found that sad feelings, when you let yourself feel them properly, tend to get bored and move on. It's only when you try to push them away that they dig in and stay." Sadie absorbed this information with the focused expression she brought to everything important. "I'm going to remember that," she said gravely. "I hope you do," Margaret said. Then came the visit from James Cooley's housekeeper, who arrived supposedly to inquire about purchasing eggs, a thing that made no sense since the Cooley household had their own laying hens, and stood in the yard making observations about the garden and the house and the general situation in the particularly irritating way of people who have come to spy and don't know they're being obvious about it. Margaret sold her the eggs and sent her on her way. Then came Frank Aldridge, Thomas Aldridge's brother, who came with what he said was a question about a shared property line, but whose eyes went immediately and repeatedly to the windows of the house, as if he was trying to see something he could report back. Margaret stood on the porch and answered his question about the property line with the patience of a woman who has nothing to hide. None of them rattled her. She had been watched and assessed and speculated about all her life, and she had long ago come to understand that the watching said more about the watchers than it said about her. What did rattle her, 3 weeks into her time at the Bennett Ranch, was the ledger. Cole brought it to her reluctantly, on a rainy evening when the children were in bed and the fire was low, setting it on the kitchen table with the slightly defeated air of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally found a place to put it down. "I've been meaning to show you this," he said, "since you mentioned you could do numbers, but I kept putting it off." She opened it. She did not say anything for a long time. She turned pages slowly, reading the columns of figures with the careful attention she gave to anything that mattered. Cole sat across from her and looked at the fire. The debt was worse than she had expected. Not unsurvivable. She did not think it was unsurvivable, but it had a particular shape she recognized, the shape of debt that has been built by someone who is patient and deliberate and has a specific design in mind. The interest terms on the main loan were unusual in the way that things are unusual when someone has been unusually clever about writing them. There were 2 notes she couldn't fully parse without more information. "Who holds this loan?" she asked. "Man named Harlan Voss," Cole said. "He's out of Sheridan. Bought up debt all across this valley over the past 7-8 years. And these 2 clauses here," she said, pointing to the pages in question. "Do you understand what they mean?" A pause. "Not entirely," he admitted. "The lawyer who looked at it when I signed, he said they were standard." "They're not standard," she said. Cole looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've seen contracts before, and I've seen what standard looks like, and these are not standard." She kept her voice even because this was not the moment for alarm. This was the moment for clarity. "I need more time with this. And I need to find out more about Harlan Voss. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the first day on the street, that steady, serious attention. Margaret, how worried should I be? She looked at him honestly. Worried enough to be careful, she said. Not so worried that you can't sleep. We'll figure it out. She meant it when she said it, though she was less certain than she sounded. But certainty, she had found, was sometimes less important than steadiness, and she had steadiness to spare. She took the ledger to her room that night and read it again by lamplight until she had memorized its every detail. When she finally set it down, her lamp was running low, and the house was completely quiet around her. It was the quietness she had started, without quite meaning to love. The quiet of a house that held sleeping people. People she had begun to think of, carefully, in that same quiet way, as hers. Not because she had any right to them, but because belonging, real belonging, doesn't wait for permission. It grows in the work you do and the meals you share and the corners you fix and the moments you sit with in the dark. And it grows whether or not you've been officially invited to let it. She sat in the quiet for a little while. Then she turned down the lamp. Outside, the Wyoming night was immense and indifferent, the same as it always was. But inside, in the small, warm dark of the Bennett Ranch house, something had taken root that had not been there 4 miles south of here when a stagecoach had rolled into Black Hollow and 3 men had looked at her and decided she was nothing, that something didn't have a name yet. But it was growing. And in the barn, she knew without having to look, the plate of molasses cookies she had left on the fence post that evening was going to be empty in the morning. It had been empty every morning for a week. Some things, she had learned, begin not with a word but with an empty plate and the willingness of one closed thing to take. Very quietly, and without admitting it yet, what has been offered. She was patient. She had all the time in the world. And then 10 days later, Sadie woke up burning. It started the way these things always start, quietly, in the dark, before anyone is prepared. Margaret heard it first, a sound beneath the normal sounds of the house, beneath the settling of timber and the distant calling of something in the fields. A small, thin sound. Almost nothing. The kind of sound a person misses if they are not already in the habit of listening carefully. She was in the habit. She was out of her bed and in the hallway before she had fully registered being awake, moving toward Sadie's room at the end of the corridor with the particular speed of someone whose body has already made a decision before their mind has caught up. She pushed open the door. Sadie was sitting up in bed, her dark hair damp against her forehead, her nightgown twisted around her small body. Her eyes were open, but they had the glassy, distant quality that does not belong in a 7-year-old's eyes, the look of someone whose mind is not entirely present in the room. "I'm cold," Sadie said. Her voice was strange, thin and far away, like it was coming from the other end of a long corridor. Margaret crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hand to the girl's forehead. The heat that met her palm was not the ordinary warmth of a child who has been sleeping under blankets on a summer night. It was something else entirely, fierce and dry and wrong in the specific way that a mother knows, or in Margaret's case, in the way that a woman knows when she has been paying attention hard enough for long enough. "You're not cold, sweetheart," Margaret said, keeping her voice absolutely steady. "You have a fever. You're going to be all right, but I need you to lie back down for me." She guided the girl back against the pillow. Sadie went without resistance, which was itself a sign. Because Sadie without resistance was not the Sadie who had opinions about egg-boiling times and morning light. Margaret went to the hall and knocked once, firmly, on Cole's door. He was awake within seconds. The sleep of a man who has been listening for trouble for 14 months. She heard him cross the floor. The door opened. He saw her face. "Sadie," she said. He was past her before she finished the word. She went to the kitchen and began heating water. She found the clean cloths she had reorganized into the linen cupboard 3 weeks ago and brought them upstairs. She found the willow bark she had quietly added to the medicine shelf after noticing the shelf held almost nothing of use. She began preparing a decoction with the efficient calm of a woman working through a list, because the list was the only thing that stood between her and the panic she refused to let have any room. When she returned to Sadie's room, Cole was sitting on the edge of the bed holding his daughter's hand with both of his. His face had gone the particular color of fear, not the gray of shock, but the tight, controlled pallor of a man who is absolutely terrified and absolutely refusing to show it, for the sake of the child looking up at him. "How high?" he asked without turning. "High enough," Margaret said. "Not so high we can't bring it down." She set the basin on the nightstand and wrung out the first cloth. "Has she been around anyone who was sick? Anything in the past week?" "The Bellows children," Cole said. "Martha brought them by on Tuesday. One of them was— I thought it was just a summer cold." "It may still be just that," Margaret said. She placed the cloth on Sadie's forehead. The girl exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. "Fevers in children run hot fast and break fast. That's often how it goes." She said it steadily, and she meant it, and she also knew, with the part of her mind that she was keeping separate from her voice, that this was not necessarily how it went. She knew this because she had nursed sick people before. Her landlady's daughter in Cheyenne, 2 children in her neighborhood, an elderly man on the floor above her at the boarding house. She knew how quickly a high fever in a small child could move in the wrong direction. And she knew one more thing that she had not yet said aloud. Cole Bennett knew it too. She could see it in the way he was holding Sadie's hand, too tightly, with the specific grip of a man holding onto something he is terrified of losing. He had held something like this before. He had been in this room, or near this room, with this same quality of fear, and he had lost. "Cole?" she said quietly. He looked up. "I need you to go wake Eli and tell him what's happening, and then I need you to ride for Dr. Hennessy in town." "It's 3 a.m. "I know what time it is." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him doing what people do in these moments, measuring the fear against the practicality, trying to decide whether riding for the doctor at 3 a.m. was the response of a sensible man or a panicking one. "Go," she said. "I'll be here." Something in the way she said it, the absolute flatness of it, the certainty, moved him. He pressed Sadie's hand once and stood. "I'll be back with Hennessy by first light," he said. "She'll be here when you get back," Margaret said. He left. She heard his boots on the stairs, Eli's door, low voices, then the sound of Cole's horse leaving the yard at a pace that said everything about the state of his heart. Eli appeared in the doorway of Sadie's room minutes later. He was still in his nightclothes, his hair flattened on one side, but his face was entirely awake. The way a face goes when the body knows something is serious before the mind can form the words for it. He looked at Sadie, and something crossed his face that he couldn't control, something young and frightened and utterly unguarded, the first thing Margaret had seen from him that was not behind the wall. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that I'm taking it seriously," she said honestly. "Not so bad that you need to be frightened yet. Come in, sit with her." He came in and sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair Cole had just vacated, and looked at his sister with an expression that cracked the wall completely, that showed her exactly what Eli Bennett was when the defenses came down. He was a 12-year-old boy who had already lost one person he loved in this house, and every line of him was braced against losing another. "She looks bad," he said. "She looks like a kid with a fever," Margaret said, "which is what she is." She wrung out another cloth and replaced the one on Sadie's forehead. "Talk to her, Eli. She's half asleep. She can still hear you. The voice is the last thing that goes. Talk to her." A pause. He looked at his sister, then, in a voice pitched very low, rough with the effort of being steady, "Hey, Sadie, it's me. I'm here. You're okay." Sadie did not respond, but something in the lines of her face eased slightly. The small, almost invisible relaxation of someone who has heard a familiar voice. Eli noticed it. He kept talking. Margaret worked around him, doing what needed to be done. Changing the cloths, measuring the bark decoction into a small cup, coaxing small sips into Sadie when she was coherent enough to swallow, checking the pulse at the girl's wrist every quarter hour, with 2 fingers pressed lightly to the thin skin there. She tracked everything: temperature, breathing rate, the color of Sadie's lips, the small shifts in restlessness or stillness that told her what was happening inside a body that could not speak for itself. The night was very long. An hour before dawn, Sadie's temperature climbed higher instead of dropping. Margaret felt it in the cloth that came away hot within minutes of being placed, in the quickening of the small pulse under her fingers. She changed her approach. Cooler water, more frequent changes, the cool cloth to the wrists and the back of the neck now as well. She did this quietly, without alarming Eli, who had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep in the chair with his head leaning against the bedpost. She sat on the edge of the bed and she did not leave it. She had told Cole that Sadie would be here when he came back, and she meant it with the full weight of a promise. Not a careless assurance, a promise, the kind that requires a person to put everything they have behind it. She put everything she had behind it. She sat in the hot lamp-lit room and she matched the fever hour for hour, and she refused to look away. There were 2 hours in the deep part of the night when the fever was at its worst, when Sadie murmured things that made no sense, when her small hands gripped and released the quilt in an irregular rhythm, when her breathing became shallow enough that Margaret counted every breath. In those 2 hours, Margaret did not move from the bed. She replaced cloths and monitored the pulse and spoke in a low, continuous voice. Not words, exactly, just a steady human sound, a presence, a reminder to the body in the bed that it was not alone in the dark. She thought, in those 2 hours, about the woman whose room this had been. About a woman she had never met who had stood in that spot by the stove because it was the warmest place in the house. About a woman whose children had needed her and who had not been able to stay. She did not know what that woman had looked like, or what her laugh had sounded like, or what small things she had loved about this ranch. But she thought that whatever that woman had been, she had been loved, fiercely, completely, in the way that left a mark so deep that 14 months of silence had not been enough to cover it. Margaret was not that woman. She would never be that woman, and she did not try to be. But she was here. And being here, she had decided, was the most important thing she could offer. Just before dawn, the fever broke. It broke the way they break when they finally go. Not gradually, but all at once, like a knot releasing. Sadie's skin went from dry and burning to cool and damp within the space of 20 minutes. Her breathing deepened, her hands unclenched from the quilt. The lines of strain left her face, and she looked suddenly like herself again, like the small, serious girl who had opinions about biscuits and morning light. Margaret let out a breath that she realized, been holding for approximately 6 hours. Eli woke at the shift in the room's atmosphere, some animal sense. He lifted his head and looked at his sister, and then he looked at Margaret. "The fever broke," Margaret said. He stared at her. Something moved in his face. A wave of something too large and too complicated to have a single name, relief and exhaustion, and a kind of grief released all at the same time. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and turned his face toward the wall for a moment. She gave him that moment. She looked away and adjusted Sadie's blanket. When Cole arrived with Dr. Hennessy at first light, he came through the door at a pace that was almost running, with the doctor's bag visible behind him and the particular fear of a man who has been riding fast for an hour with his heart in his throat. He took the stairs 2 at a time. He appeared in the doorway of Sadie's room. He took in the scene, Sadie sleeping peacefully, color returning to her face. Margaret seated beside the bed, lamp still burning, cloths folded neatly on the nightstand. Eli in the chair, awake, watching his sister breathe. Cole stopped. He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter sleeping, and something happened in his face that Margaret looked away from, because it was too private to witness directly. It was the face of a man who has been preparing for the worst for a very long time, and has just been told he doesn't need to today. Dr. Hennessy came in past him, cheerful and professional in the way of men accustomed to being called out in the dark, and examined Sadie with brisk thoroughness. "Fever's down," he said, colors returning. "Whatever it was, it's past the worst. She needs rest, fluids, and watching for the next 24 hours. Nothing more than that now." He looked at Margaret. "You bring that fever down yourself?" "Yes," she said. "How long were you up with her?" "All night." Hennessy looked at her with the particular appreciation of a man who knows what an all-night vigil with a sick child actually requires. "You did well," he said simply. "She might have gone the other way, earlier in the night. You kept her steady." Cole from the doorway said nothing. He had no words for it yet. She could see that. The way the thing was too large for words right now, the way it needed to sit and settle before language could reach it. She did not need him to speak. What she needed was coffee and perhaps 4 hours of sleep. She stood from the chair, and her body reminded her, in the full inventory of aches and stiffnesses, exactly what the night had cost. She carried the basin to the hall, and she was halfway to the kitchen stairs when she heard Eli's voice behind her. "Miss Holloway." She turned. He was standing in the corridor outside Sadie's door. He was looking at her directly, not at the middle air space between them that he had always addressed before, but at her face, at her eyes, with an expression that had in it none of the wall and all of what the wall had been protecting. "Thank you," he said. It was just 2 words. But the way he said them, with the full weight of a 12-year-old boy who does not say things he does not mean, made them more than 2 words. "She's your sister," Margaret said. "I wasn't going to let anything happen to her." He nodded, looked down briefly, then back up. And then he said the thing that she would carry for the rest of her life, the thing that cost him the most and meant the most because of it. "Mom," he said. Just that. 1 syllable. Quiet and rough and uncertain, and more certain than anything he had said in over a year. Margaret stood very still. The ache in her body from the all-night vigil was completely irrelevant. Everything was completely irrelevant except this boy in this corridor and this word that had just crossed the distance between them. The distance she had spent weeks walking toward patiently. The distance she had not tried to cross by force because she understood that some distances can only be closed from both sides. He had just closed it from his side. She crossed it from hers. "Go sit with her," she said. Her voice was steady, though it cost her something to make it so. "She'll want to see you when she wakes up." He nodded once. He went back into the room. Margaret stood in the corridor alone for a moment. Just a moment. The morning light was coming through the window at the end of the hall. The same light Sadie loved. The light that came at a particular angle she had decided was her favorite thing about the house. Then she went downstairs and made coffee and started breakfast because the ranch still needed feeding and the day had already started without anyone's permission, the way days do. Cole found her in the kitchen an hour later. He had been up with Sadie while the doctor examined her one final time, and then he had seen Hennessy off and put the horse up. And now he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Margaret standing at the stove, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You were there all night," he said finally. "Yes." "You never called me back when it got worse." "There was nothing you could have done that I wasn't already doing," she said. And Sadie needed at least one person in that room who wasn't afraid. "You weren't afraid?" She turned from the stove and looked at him honestly. "Of course I was afraid," she said. "I was terrified. But being terrified and doing the work anyway are not mutually exclusive. That's something women learn early." He looked at her for a long time. The morning light was on his face, and she could see in it the particular quality of a man being rearranged by something, having his understanding of a situation shifted at a fundamental level, the way tectonic things shift, deep and slow and permanent. "I owe you something I don't have the words for yet," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "She's mine too, a little bit. Whether she is or not by any official reckoning, she is, and Eli is, and this ranch is." She paused. "I should have asked your permission before I felt that way, but I didn't, and I'm not sorry." He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was something she would think about later when she had time to think. The look of a man finding that the distance he had been maintaining between himself and the world had been crossed without his noticing, and discovering, to his own surprise, that he did not want to put it back. She turned back to the stove. "Sit down," she said. "You've been up all night too. Eat something." He sat down. She put a plate in front of him. They ate together in the morning kitchen while the ranch came back to life around them. The animals raising their voices, the sunlight strengthening, the ordinary morning sounds of a place that was, against the odds and with more effort than it should have required, still standing. Outside, 4 miles south, the town of Black Hollow was waking up. People were opening their stores, starting their fires, beginning another ordinary day with no idea that in the night just past, something had shifted quietly and permanently on the North Road. Something that could not be seen yet from town, but that would, in time, make itself impossible to ignore. Sadie recovered the way children recover when the worst has passed, completely, and without apparent memory of how frightened everyone around her had been. Within 4 days, she was back at Margaret's elbow in the kitchen, back to having opinions about breakfast, back to the serious and relentless business of being 7 years old in a world that had no shortage of things to investigate. The ranch recovered too. Not all at once, nothing real happens all at once, but in the accumulating way of things that are being tended properly. The fence sections Margaret had cataloged in her notepad got repaired one by one over the weeks that followed. The kitchen garden came back to life with the kind of slow, stubborn insistence that growing things have when they've been neglected rather than destroyed. The roots were still there, still reaching. The chicken coop was properly wired. The pump handle was fixed with the part Margaret had ridden to town for, and it no longer stuck on the upstroke. Eli did not call her mom again, not immediately, but something had changed in the architecture of how he occupied the same space as her. The crossed arms were gone mostly. He began appearing in the kitchen in the evenings without a specific reason, sitting at the table with a book or a piece of tack he was mending, simply present in the way that a person is present when they have decided, without making an announcement about it, that they want to be near someone. He still didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed its quality entirely. It was no longer a wall. It was simply the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other well enough to not require constant words. The ledger, however, did not recover on its own. The ledger required something else. Margaret had been living with the numbers for weeks by then, carrying them in her head the way she carried everything important. Not written on a list somewhere she might lose, but memorized, turned over regularly, examined from different angles. She understood the debt now in its full shape, understood the particular intelligence that had constructed it. Harlan Voss had not built his contracts carelessly. He had built them the way a careful man builds a trap, with patience, with attention to detail, with a thorough understanding of how a desperate person signs what they are given without reading what they have signed. Cole had signed the original loan note 4 months before his wife died. She had been ill by then. Not visibly, not to outside eyes, but ill enough that Cole had been distracted, frightened, and not sleeping well. Voss had chosen his moment with the precision of a man who had done this before. She brought what she had found to Cole on a Sunday evening in early September, when the light outside was going golden and the children were occupied, Sadie drawing pictures at the kitchen table, Eli in the barn doing what Eli did in the barn. She spread the relevant pages of the ledger on the table between them, and she walked him through it the way she had walked through it herself, step by careful step. "This clause here," she said, pointing to the paragraph she had read until she could recite it from memory. "Do you see what it says about the interest calculation?" Cole leaned over the page. He read it. He read it again. "It says the interest compounds if any payment is more than 15 days late. That's what it appears to say, but read this part. The phrase computing period is defined in Clause 11, which is 4 pages earlier." She turned the pages. "Here, the computing period isn't monthly, it's weekly, which means if you miss a monthly payment deadline by 15 days, the interest doesn't compound monthly. It compounds on every weekly interval within that period." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I understood when I signed." "I know it isn't, because it isn't written in the place where you would expect to find it. It's defined in a separate clause, using language that sounds like routine boilerplate. If you didn't read every page with the specific intention of connecting the definitions to the provisions, you would never catch it." She paused. "There's more." She turned to the second page she had marked. "This provision, the acceleration clause. It says Voss can demand full repayment of the outstanding balance immediately if the value of the collateral property declines by more than 20%, as assessed by Voss's own designated appraiser." Cole looked up. "He can use his own appraiser?" "His own designated appraiser, which means he can initiate an assessment at any time, using someone who works for him, who can determine that your land has declined in value and then demand the full balance within 30 days. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man seeing something he should have seen a long time ago, and understanding why he didn't, and then understanding what it means now that he does. "He's been doing this to other ranches," Cole said. It was not quite a question. "I believe so. Yes." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "I've been talking to people, carefully, while I've been in town for supplies. The Garrity family on the South Road, they lost their ranch 18 months ago when Voss's appraiser declared a sudden 22% decline in land value. The Peterson brothers, they're paying interest on a note that has grown to nearly double what they originally borrowed, and they can't understand why." She looked at him steadily. "This is not bad luck, Cole. This is a system. He built it deliberately, and he's been running it for years." Cole stood up from the table. He went to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the yard, at the fence they had fixed together, and the garden that was producing again, and the barn that held his horses and his children's futures. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the particular tension of a man who has just had the shape of his problem clarified and found it worse and more specific than he feared. "What can we do?" he asked, without turning. "There's a lawyer in Rawlins," she said. "His name is Edmund Cartwright. I found a reference to him in a notice at the express office. He handled a contract dispute for a mining company 3 years ago and won on the basis of ambiguous clause definitions. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. Ambiguous clause definitions that are ambiguous by design." Cole turned from the window. "Rawlins is a full day's ride." "I know. And lawyers cost money." "I know that too, but listen to me. If Cartwright can argue that the interest calculation clause is unenforceable due to deliberate obfuscation, we're not just talking about your debt. We're talking about every debt Voss holds in this valley constructed the same way. Cartwright might take this on a different basis than a standard fee if he understands the scope of it." Cole looked at her. "You've already written to him." It was not a questions. He knew her well enough by now to know that she had not come to this conversation with a problem and no proposed solution. "I wrote to him 2 weeks ago," she said. "I received a reply yesterday." She reached into the front pocket of her apron and produced a folded letter. "He wants to meet. He says the clause structure I described in my letter is, in his words, consistent with a pattern of predatory contract construction he has been documenting for some time." Cole took the letter, read it, set it down on the table beside the ledger. "You wrote to a lawyer," he said slowly, "without telling me." "I was going to tell you when I had something worth telling you about," she said. "I didn't see the point in raising your hopes before I knew whether he'd respond." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, the one that meant he was turning something over in his mind and finding it both more and less surprising than he expected. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They rode to Rawlins the following week, leaving the children with the Hennessy family in town. Dr. Hennessy's wife, Clara, had taken a particular liking to Sadie and had invited them more than once. Cole drove the wagon, and Margaret sat beside him with Cartwright's letter in her bag and the annotated ledger and every note she had made over the past weeks, organized in the orderly manner of someone who has learned that the difference between winning and losing an argument is usually the difference between having your evidence ready and wishing you did. Edmund Cartwright's office occupied the second floor of a building on Rawlins Main Street, above a land surveying company. He was a compact man in his late 50s with sharp gray eyes and the particular precision of someone who has spent decades reading words with the understanding that words are the field on which the most important battles are fought. He shook Margaret's hand before Cole's, which was not standard and which she noted. "Mrs. he began. "Miss Holloway," she said, "I'm the one who wrote to you." "Yes," he said, with a look that suggested he had been curious about this and was now adjusting some prior assumption. "Sit down, please, both of you." She laid out the ledger and her notes on his desk with the calm efficiency of someone presenting a case, which was, in fact, what she was doing. She walked him through it in the same order she had walked Cole through it, the same logical progression from provision to definition to implication, while Cartwright followed along with a pencil making small notations in the margin of his own notepad. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The cross-referencing of the computing period definition," he said. "You found that yourself?" "Yes. Without legal training. Without formal legal training," she said. "I've read a great deal, and I've kept accounts, and I've found that numbers and legal language have something in common. They both repay careful attention." Cartwright tapped his pencil on the notepad. "The Garrity foreclosure you mentioned in your letter. Do you know if they kept any copies of their original loan documents? I spoke to Eliza Garrity in town last week. She has the documents. She's willing to speak to you if you contact her." Cartwright looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Holloway, how many ranches in this valley do you believe are carrying notes structured similarly to Mr. Bennett's?" "Based on what I've been able to gather from conversations, I believe at least 6, possibly more. Voss has been operating here for 8 years. He's patient. He doesn't move on a property until the debt has grown large enough that the owner has no practical choice." "And you believe the Garrity foreclosure was his first completed acquisition in this valley?" "I believe it was the first. I believe he intended Mr. Bennett's ranch to be the second. And I believe he was planning to move on the Peterson brothers within the year. Cartwright set down his pencil. He looked at Cole. Mr. Bennett, your property is not in immediate danger. Voss has not yet initiated an assessment, which tells me he was still in the accumulation phase, adding to the debt through the compounding mechanism before triggering the acceleration clause. Miss Holloway's letter to me may have interrupted that timing if word has reached him that someone is looking at his contracts carefully. Cole glanced at Margaret. I was not discreet with the Garrity's and the Petersons, she said, deliberately. Cartwright almost smiled. Deliberately, I see. He picked up his pencil again. I will need time to review the full documents and to contact the other affected parties. But I want to be direct with you. What you've brought me today is not simply a contract dispute. If the pattern holds across multiple properties, this is a case of systematic fraud. The remedy is not just Mr. Bennett's debt. The remedy, if we pursue it fully, is the unwinding of every fraudulent note Voss holds in this valley. The room was very quiet. Cole said, How long would that take? Months, perhaps longer. Cartwright looked at them both. But Miss Holloway is correct that this is worth pursuing, and I will tell you, Mr. Bennett, that I will take this case on a contingency basis. Cole frowned. What does that mean? It means I take my fee from the settlement, if we win, rather than from your pocket now. He paused. I don't do this often, but what Miss Holloway found in your ledger is the cleanest example of this particular pattern of predatory construction I have seen in 30 years of practice. A case this clean is useful to me professionally as well as just. Margaret felt something shift in the room, a change in pressure, the way the air changes before rain. She had hoped for this but had not counted on it, and there was a difference between those two things that she felt clearly now in the region of her chest. They drove back to Black Hollow in the long afternoon light. Cole drove, and she sat beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. The land was the same land it had always been, massive and indifferent in its Wyoming way, but it looked different from the wagon bench today. It looked like something worth fighting for, which it had always been, but which was easier to see now that there was a shape to the fight. You knew, Cole said finally. When you first looked at that ledger, you knew it was bad. I knew it was worse than you understood, she said. I didn't know all of it yet. But you started finding out immediately. That's what you do when something threatens your home, she said. The word home sat between them in the air for a moment after she said it, deliberate and quiet and fully meant. Cole kept his eyes on the road. Our home, he said. Just that. Not a question. Our home, she said. News of a legal challenge against Harlan Voss's contracts moved through the valley the way everything moved through Black Hollow. In 2 days, everyone knew. The town's reaction was more complex than Margaret had expected, which was to say it was more human than she had expected. There was fear. Voss was powerful and had influential connections in Sheridan. And there was disbelief, directed largely at the idea that a woman with no legal training had found the flaw that lawyers had missed. And there was something else, something that took longer to surface but eventually did, a particular quality of attention turning in her direction that was different in kind from the attention she had been receiving since the day she stepped off the stagecoach. It started with Frank Peterson appearing at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, asking if he could speak to Miss Holloway about his own loan documents. She sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 hours and showed him what she had found in Cole's ledger and how to look for the same structures in his own. He left with his documents and a sheet of notes written in her careful hand. Then his brother arrived 2 days later with the same request. Then Eliza Garrity, who wept quietly through the first 15 minutes of their meeting and then dried her eyes and asked sharp, practical questions for the next 90. Then a rancher named Dawson from the far end of the valley, who had heard from the Garritys and driven 4 hours to ask for an hour of her time. Margaret gave them all the time they needed. The kitchen table, which had once been a quiet place at the edge of grief, became something else, a kind of informal courthouse, a place where people came with their fears and their papers and left with a clear understanding of both. Sadie took to greeting visitors at the door with the serious hospitality of a child who has decided this is important. Eli, who had begun helping Margaret in the evenings with correspondence, he had a neat hand and wrote faster than she did, sat at the far end of the table copying out notes without being asked. Cole watched all of this with an expression that had, over the weeks, settled into something she thought of as quiet wonder. The look of a man watching something unfold that he did not plan and could not have predicted, and finding it more than he knew how to say. The day the banker from the First Cattlemen's Bank of Black Hollow came to the ranch, Margaret knew the tide had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he had, on the day she arrived in Black Hollow, been standing in front of his bank watching three men walk away from her with an expression that had made no effort at sympathy. He was a careful man who had made a career of managing the direction of his attention, and his attention had not been directed at Margaret Holloway on that first day with anything resembling respect. He came alone. He knocked at the front door. Eli answered it, because Eli answered the door now, had appointed himself to this role without announcement. "I'd like to speak with Miss Holloway," Whitmore said. Eli considered this for a moment with the evaluating look that he had entirely inherited from his father. "Come in," he said. "I'll see if she's available." He found her in the garden. She was harvesting the late summer beans, her hands moving along the vines with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made peace with physical work. Eli appeared at the garden gate. "Whitmore from the bank is here," he said. "He wants to talk to you." "Does he?" She straightened, brushed her hands clean on her apron. "All right." She walked into the front room and Whitmore was standing in the middle of it, turning his hat in his hands, and she thought, not unkindly, but clearly, that this was a man in the unfamiliar position of needing something from a person he had previously not bothered to see. "Mr. Whitmore," she said pleasantly. "Miss Holloway." He cleared his throat. "I'll be direct if you don't mind." "I'd prefer it," she said. Harlan Voss also holds a note on property that is adjacent to the bank's interests. I've looked at the note recently, in light of what's been discussed in town, and I believe I may have found the same patterns you identified in Mr. Bennett's loan. He paused. "I'd be grateful for your assessment." She looked at him for a moment. He was, she thought, a decent man who had done what many decent people do, made small, careless cruelties by failing to look carefully enough at the people in front of him. She did not hold it against him more than it deserved. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Let me see the document." He sat. She read it. She found, in the third page, exactly what she expected to find. "Here," she said, pointing, "and here." He leaned over and read. "Lord," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her, and in his face was an expression she was beginning to recognize from a variety of faces across the valley. The expression of a person revising a prior judgment, and not entirely comfortable with the revision, but making it anyway because the evidence required it. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the day you arrived, the way things went. I stood there and watched, and I didn't—" "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "do you want to beat yourself up about that day, or do you want to help your neighbors get their land back?" He blinked. Then slowly, he almost smiled. "The second one," he said. "Good," she said. "Then let's talk about how." The legal proceedings against Harlan Voss did not move quickly. Nothing of real consequence ever does. Edmund Cartwright filed the initial challenge in the territorial court at the end of September on behalf of Cole Bennett, and by the time the papers were drawn up, 4 additional ranching families whose loan documents Margaret had reviewed and annotated at the kitchen table over the preceding weeks. The filing was precise, methodical, and built on the foundation Margaret had laid: the cross-referenced clause definitions, the compounding mechanism hidden behind routine language, the acceleration provision tied to an appraiser Voss controlled. Cartwright had added to her findings the case history he had been quietly assembling for years, and together the 2 bodies of evidence made something formidable. Voss responded through his own lawyers within 2 weeks. He was not a man who became frightened easily, and his initial response made that clear. It was aggressive, dismissive, and contained language designed to suggest that the challenge was frivolous and would be disposed of quickly. His lawyers argued that all parties had signed voluntarily, that the documents were legally valid, and that Miss Holloway's analysis represented the amateur misreading of standard commercial contract language by someone with no legal standing in the matter. Margaret read the response when Cartwright forwarded a copy to the ranch. She read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and made herself a cup of coffee and thought about it carefully. "What does it mean?" Cole asked, watching her from across the table. "It means he's worried," she said. Cole frowned. That response didn't sound worried. It sounded like a man who thinks he's going to win. I know what it sounded like, she said. But a man who is not worried doesn't file a response in 2 weeks. He waits. He makes you come to him. Voss filed in 2 weeks because he wants this over before it gets bigger, and it's already bigger than he expected. She turned the cup in her hands. He didn't know about Cartwright's prior research. He assumed whoever was challenging him had only Bennett's documents. He didn't anticipate that someone had spent months quietly talking to every family in this valley and building a complete picture. She paused. We're going to write to Cartwright today and suggest he file the Peterson and Garrity documents simultaneously before Voss's lawyers can build separate defenses for each case. If they're consolidated, the pattern becomes undeniable. Cole looked at her across the steam of his coffee. You thought about all of this just now. I've been thinking about it since the day I first opened your ledger, she said. I was waiting to see how he'd respond before deciding which piece to play next. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the way of a man continually arriving at the same realization from different directions. They wrote to Cartwright that afternoon. The winter came to Wyoming the way it always did, with total intention and no apology. The first hard frost arrived in early October, and the snow that followed it in November was not tentative. The ranch buttoned itself down for the season. Animals closer in, stores properly laid in, the root cellar finally functioning as it should, now that the door had been planned, true, and rehung. The kitchen was warm in a way it had not been the previous winter, not just from the stove, but from the accumulated warmth of a house that was being lived in rather than merely survived. Sadie had started reading more complex books, guided by Margaret through the evenings, their heads bent together over the lamp. Eli had, without announcement, begun helping with the ranch accounts. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he had watched Margaret work with numbers long enough to understand their usefulness, and because he was his father's son in the way that some qualities simply move through generations, whether or not anyone plans it. He had also, in the past month, begun calling her mom with a consistency that was still quiet, still without ceremony, but no longer uncertain. He said it the way a person says a word they have decided on, settled and deliberate. She did not say anything about it that would make it into a moment he might feel self-conscious about. She simply answered to it, naturally, as though it had always been true, because she had decided it was. It was on a snow-muffled Thursday morning in late November that the first of the three men came back. She heard the horse in the yard and looked through the kitchen window and recognized Thomas Aldridge from his particular narrow-shouldered silhouette even before she could make out his face. He sat on his horse in the yard for a long moment before dismounting. The hesitation of a man who has ridden somewhere with a purpose and is now, in the final yards of the journey, reconsidering the wisdom of it. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the kitchen door before he knocked. He stood on the porch step, hat in hand, and he looked at her. And she could see on his face the particular labor of a man who has rehearsed what he intended to say and is finding, now, that the rehearsed version is insufficient. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Aldridge." She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold." He came in. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he looked around, at the warm room, at the herbs hung to dry, at the neat shelves and the bread rising on the counter and the evidence everywhere of a house that was genuinely alive. And something moved through his face that she thought was probably more complicated than he would have been able to describe. She poured him coffee without asking and set it on the table and sat down across from it, which was an invitation and also a statement, and he sat. "I heard about what you've been doing," he said, "with the contracts, the legal case." "Word travels," she said. "Frank Peterson told me you spent 2 hours with him going through his loan documents, that you found the same problem in his note as in Bennett's." He turned the coffee cup once. Peterson's ranch would have been gone inside of 2 years. His family's been there since before I came to this valley. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My brother came to you too, last month." "He did. He said you didn't. He said you were—" He stopped. Tried again. "He said you were kind to him." "He came with a problem he needed help with," Margaret said. "That's what I was here for." Aldridge looked at his coffee. The particular look of a man whose next words are going to cost him something. "What I did," he said slowly, "the day you arrived, in front of the town, walking away like that, I've been—" He stopped again. "I don't have an excuse for it. I thought I did at the time. I told myself things that seemed reasonable at the time, but they weren't. They were just comfortable. He looked up. I'm sorry, Miss Holloway. I'm genuinely sorry for it. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man. She had never thought he was a bad man. He was simply a man who had made a bad choice, the kind that small cowardices make easy and regret makes permanent. I accept your apology, Mr. Aldridge, she said, and I want you to know something. What you did that day cost you very little. It cost me a great deal. I want you to understand that difference, not so that you feel worse about it, but so that you carry it forward accurately. What seems like nothing to the person doing it is often everything to the person it's being done to. He nodded. His jaw was tight. I understand. Good, she said. Now finish your coffee and tell me about your own note with Voss, because I'd wager you have one, and I'd wager I can find the same language in it that I found in everyone else's. He blinked. Yes, I do have a note with Voss. Did you bring it? A pause. Then, from inside his coat, he produced a folded document. She almost smiled. You came prepared, she said. Frank Peterson told me to bring it, he admitted. She took the document and opened it on the table and found what she needed in less than 10 minutes, because she knew exactly where to look. Harold Pruitt came 2 days later, which she had half expected. The two men were known to move in proximity to each other, in the way of people who have been neighbors long enough to share habits. He was less articulate about his apology than Aldridge had been, which was perhaps more honest, because Pruitt was a man who expressed things better through presence than through language. He came in and sat down and said, I was wrong, and I knew it when I was doing it, and I didn't stop myself, and I should have. Which was not elegant, but was thorough. And then he pushed his loan documents across the table without being asked. James Cooley came third, and he was the hardest. Not because he was cruel, he was no longer cruel if he had ever truly been, and she had long ago stopped holding his cruelty as a personal wound. He was hard because he was the one who had said, it's nothing personal while doing the most personal thing a person can do to another person. And he was the one who had written 4 letters full of warmth that had not been false exactly, but had been conditional in a way he had not been honest about. He had known what she looked like in her own words, and he had let himself imagine something else. And when the something else didn't appear, he had been unkind in the manner of people who are primarily disappointed with themselves and aim it outward. He arrived on a gray December afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and the snow was packed hard on the ground. He tied his horse at the post and stood in the yard for a long moment before coming to the door, and when she opened it, he looked at her with an expression that had in it something she had not expected, not just regret, but a kind of shame that was specific and clear and undisguised. Miss Holloway, he said. Mr. Cooley, I heard that you... He stopped, started again. I heard what you've been doing for the families in this valley. What you found, what you built here. He gestured slightly at the ranch behind her, the fixed fence, the sound barn, the smoke rising from the chimney. I came because I need to say something to you, and I've been trying to find the right words for 2 months. And I don't think there are right words, so I'm going to say the wrong ones and hope they're enough. She waited. I said it wasn't personal, he said. On that day. I said it wasn't personal, and I knew when I said it that it was the most personal thing I had ever done to another human being. And I said it anyway because I was a coward, Miss Holloway. Because I was more afraid of what people would think of me than I was concerned about what I was doing to you. I had written you 4 letters. I knew who you were. And I chose what people would see over who you actually were, and I have not been able to sit comfortably in my own skin since the day I did it. The yard was very quiet around them. Snow and silence and the distant sound of Eli moving something in the barn. Margaret looked at James Cooley for a long moment. She saw a man who had spent several months living with himself, which is sometimes the most effective punishment available. Come in, Mr. Cooley, she said. He came in. She poured coffee. She let him sit with the apology for a few minutes before she said anything, because some apologies need to breathe before they become useful. I want to tell you something, she said finally. What you did hurt me. Not because I needed you specifically, or because I had made some plan around you, but because after 11 days of travel and all the hope that goes with that, being laughed at in public is a particular kind of pain. It gets into places. She looked at him steadily. I'm not telling you this to prolong your guilt. I'm telling you because I think you should know it accurately, the same as I told Aldridge. When you're the one walking away, it feels like nothing. It isn't nothing. Cooley nodded. His hands were around his coffee cup and his knuckles were tight. But I also want to tell you this, she continued. I am not certain I would have ended up here if that day had gone differently. I might have married one of you and spent my life being a reasonable wife to a reasonable man and never sat down at this table and never looked at this ledger and never, she paused, thought about the right word, never become who I seem to be becoming. She looked around the kitchen, at the herbs and the bread and the window box she had planted in October with the cold, hardy herbs that would winter over and come back in spring. So I can't hold the day against you the way I might have, because the day led here, and here is... She paused again. Here is everything. Cooley looked at her for a long moment. You're a remarkable woman, he said, not in the way men say it as a substitute for real thought, but in the way of someone reporting an observation accurately. I'm a practical one, she said, which is its own kind of remarkable, depending on the situation. And then, because she was who she asked him about his note with Voss, and he produced it from his coat, and she found the clause in 4 minutes flat. The hearing before the territorial judge was held in February, in a courtroom in Rawlins that was cold enough that everyone kept their coats on. 6 ranch families were represented, along with the First Cattlemen's Bank of Black Hollow, whose own exposure to Voss's contract language Gerald Whitmore had finally and fully disclosed. Edmund Cartwright presented the consolidated case with the calm precision of a man who has been preparing for this specific argument for the better part of a decade and knows exactly where every piece belongs. Margaret sat in the gallery beside Cole and did not testify. That was not her role here, and she understood the difference between the work that happens at a kitchen table and the work that happens in a courtroom. She had done her part. Cartwright would do his. But Voss's lead attorney, in his rebuttal, made a decision that Voss would later spend considerable time regretting. He mentioned Margaret by name. He described her to the judge as a woman with no legal training, no professional standing, and no recognized expertise in contract law, whose amateur analysis of routine commercial documents has been used to construct a frivolous challenge against a legitimate creditor. He said this with the confidence of a man who believes that describing someone's limitations is the same as demonstrating them. Judge Alistair Howell, who had been on the territorial bench for 22 years and had developed very specific opinions about lawyers who attempted to win arguments by belittling the opposing party's sources rather than addressing the opposing party's evidence, removed his reading glasses and looked over them at Voss's attorney with an expression that experienced courtroom observers would later describe as the judicial equivalent of a cold front moving in. Counsel, he said, I have before me a set of annotated loan documents whose analysis, regardless of who performed it, reveals a clause construction that this court finds, at minimum, worthy of serious examination. I would suggest that you address the substance of that analysis, rather than the biography of the person who performed it. A silence fell in the courtroom. Voss's attorney addressed the substance for the next 40 minutes, and he was skilled, and he made the best case available to him. But the best case available to him was not strong enough, because Margaret had found every thread and Cartwright had pulled every one of them, and the case they had built together was the kind that does not have loose ends. Judge Howell deliberated for 9 days. His ruling was 37 pages long. Margaret read all 37 pages twice. The core finding was precisely what Cartwright had argued. The cross-reference computing period definition, in combination with the acceleration clause tied to Voss's own appraiser, constituted a contract structure designed to obscure material terms from signatories operating under financial distress. All notes in the consolidated case were declared unenforceable in their current form. Voss was ordered to restate all outstanding debts at simple interest from the original principal, removing all compounded interest accumulated under the fraudulent mechanism. The Garrity foreclosure, the first, the one that had gone through before anyone understood what was happening, was subject to a separate proceeding to determine remedy. It was, Cartwright wrote to Margaret in his letter accompanying the ruling, the most comprehensive victory he had achieved in 30 years of practice. Cole read the ruling at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late February, while Sadie sat beside him drawing horses in her sketchbook, and Eli sat at the far end of the table doing arithmetic in his school copybook. The fire was good, and the lamps were lit, and outside the snow was coming down in the patient, unhurried way of a Wyoming winter that knows it owns the landscape for a few more weeks yet. He read to the end. He set the pages down. He looked at Margaret, who was sitting across from him with her own copy, which she had already read twice. "It's over," he said. "The legal part," she said. "Voss still has to comply. Cartwright will watch that. And there's still the Garrity proceeding. But the ranch is safe," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. The firelight was on his face, and she could see in it everything that the past 7 months had moved through him. The grief that was still there, the way it would always be there, but changed in its relationship to everything else. No longer the largest thing in the room. The exhaustion of a man who had been holding something together alone for too long and had finally been allowed to put part of it down. The particular look of a person who has watched something they couldn't have imagined unfold in front of them and is still in the process of believing it. "Margaret," he said. "Cole." He was quiet for a moment. Sadie had stopped drawing and was watching them both with the frank attention of a child who knows something important is happening, even if she doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. Eli had put his pencil down. "I have something I want to say," Cole said, "and I've been trying to find the right time, and I've decided there isn't a right time. There's only this time, which is the time I have." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not good at the kind of talking this requires. I want you to know that before I start, so that when I do it badly, you'll understand why." "You're doing fine so far," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "When you sat down on that step in front of the express office," he said slowly, "and I walked across the street, I want you to know what I saw. It wasn't what the town saw. What the town saw was a woman who'd been rejected. What I saw was—" He paused, looking for it. "I saw a woman who was doing arithmetic, who was sitting in the middle of the worst public humiliation I've ever witnessed, and she was doing arithmetic, and she was completely upright, and she had not let a single thing any of those men did touch the fundamental dignity she carried." He stopped. His jaw was working slightly. "I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't know what to do with it. I just knew I wanted it near me, near my children. I knew that whatever that was, whatever you were made of, I wanted my children to learn it." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's what I married," he said. "If you'll allow me to say it that way, that's what I came to love. Not because you saved the ranch, not because of the legal case or the ledger or any of the things everyone in the valley is talking about, but because you sat on that step in the dust and you did not let them make you small, and you have never, not once in 7 months, let anyone make you small. And I think that is He stopped. The right word seemed to be failing him, and he accepted that it was failing him, which was itself the right thing to do. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "If you're willing, if that's something you want, I'm asking." Sadie put down her pencil with great deliberateness. "I want her to say yes," she announced, "just so everyone knows where I stand." "Sadie," Eli said, and then immediately, "I agree with her, though." Margaret looked at Cole across the kitchen table, across the lamp and the legal papers and the remnants of dinner and the accumulated ordinary evidence of a life being lived together. And she thought about a stagecoach and $7.30 and a wooden step in the Wyoming dust, and how she had sat on that step and calculated the arithmetic of her situation and found it wanting, and how a man with river-colored eyes had crossed a street and changed the calculation entirely. She thought about Sadie saying yours tastes like that too, a little bit, with the morning light on her face. She thought about an empty plate on a fence post, morning after morning, until the boy who wouldn't speak chose to. She thought about a ledger and a lamp burning low and the quiet of a house full of sleeping people she had somehow, without permission or official ceremony, made hers. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing. That's something I want." Sadie made a sound of pure satisfaction. Eli, who had inherited his father's relationship with large emotions, simply nodded once, firmly, and picked up his pencil again, though the small thing happening at the corner of his mouth was the same small thing that happened at the corner of his father's mouth, and Margaret saw it clearly. Cole reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and work-roughened and entirely steady. She turned her hand over and held his. They were married on the first Saturday of March. when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had the particular quality it gets in early spring. The quality of something returning, of a world reconsidering its position. The ceremony was simple and small. Dr. Hennessy and Clara attended. The Peterson brothers came. Eliza Garrity came, wearing the good dress she had not had occasion to wear since before her ranch was taken, and which she had put on that morning with the determined air of a woman reclaiming something. Frank Aldridge came, and Harold Pruitt, and Gerald Whitmore from the bank, and a dozen other families from across the valley who came less because they had been specifically invited and more because word had traveled and people had decided they wanted to be present for it. James Cooley came too. He stood near the back and said nothing except to shake Cole's hand afterward with a grip that communicated more than words usually manage, and to look at Margaret for a moment with an expression that was the final, settled version of everything his apology had been reaching for. She nodded to him. He nodded back. That was enough, and both of them knew it. Sadie wore her best dress and a ribbon she had chosen herself and stood beside Margaret with the gravity of someone performing an important official function. Eli stood beside his father in his good shirt, his dark hair combed flat, his jaw set in the particular expression he wore when he was feeling something large and managing it in the Bennett way, by standing up straight and looking forward. When the moment came for the words to be said, Cole said them in his plain, careful way, the way of a man who does not spend words he doesn't mean. Margaret said hers in her plain, steady way, the way of a woman who has learned that the most important words are the ones you mean completely and say simply. And then it was done. Afterward, the gathering moved to the Bennett ranch, their ranch, a detail that settled into Margaret with a warmth she could feel in her hands. And Clara Hennessy and Eliza Garrity had conspired to bring enough food that the table was full in a way that required both leaves to be inserted, a thing Margaret had not seen in the months she'd been there. Sadie circulated among the guests with the proprietary pride of a child who has decided this entire occasion is something she made happen through the power of wanting it hard enough, and perhaps she was not entirely wrong. At some point in the afternoon, Margaret found herself standing near the kitchen window. Her kitchen window, the one with the winter light that Sadie loved, with Eliza Garrity beside her. The older woman was looking out at the yard, at the people moving through it, at the ranch that was alive in a way that had not been visible from the outside the day Margaret had first seen it. "You know what they called you," Eliza said. Not cruelly, just directly, the way women are direct with each other when the ceremony of politeness has been set aside. "When you first came, the fat mail-order bride nobody wanted." "I know," Margaret said. "Half those people out there used to say it." "I know that too." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "And none of them," she said slowly, "none of them can imagine this valley without you now. 5 months ago, Thomas Aldridge would have laughed if you'd told him he'd be standing in your kitchen eating your food and being grateful to you for saving his land. And look at him." She gestured at Aldridge, who was in fact standing near the far wall eating a piece of pie with the expression of a man at peace with where he is. "People change when circumstances require it," Margaret said. "That's not a miracle. That's just how people work." "Maybe," Eliza said, "but it usually requires someone to show them the way." She looked at Margaret sideways. "You're not angry at any of them, are you?" "Not really." "No," Margaret said, "not anymore." "How did you manage that?" Margaret considered the question genuinely, because it was a genuine question. "I decided early on," she said, "that the energy I could spend being angry at them was the same energy I could spend building something. And building something always felt like the better use." She paused. "Anger is a fair response to being wronged, but it's not a strategy. You can feel it, and you can set it aside, and you can do the work anyway. The work was always more interesting than the anger." Eliza looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. "Lord, I wish I'd been half as sensible at your age." "You would have been," Margaret said, "if someone had shown you it was possible." The afternoon moved toward evening, and people began to leave in ones and twos, bundled against the March cold, their breath making small clouds in the early dark. Each departure came with a handshake or a word or a particular look that communicated the specific thing that did not have a name. The recognition, from people who had once looked at her and seen a punchline, that the thing they had dismissed had turned out to be the most durable thing in the valley. Aldridge, leaving, stopped and said,
I hope you'll let me be useful to you going forward if there's anything the ranch needs." He meant it plainly, and she took it plainly. Whitmore pressed Cole's hand and said, "You married well, Bennett," with the slightly rueful air of a man acknowledging that he had been comprehensively wrong about something.
The Peterson brothers left together as they had arrived, and Frank turned back at the gate and called out, "Thank you, Margaret," across the yard. Not Miss Holloway, not any formality, just her name, the way people use a name when they mean it to carry weight. When the last of them had gone, the ranch was quiet again. The good winter quiet, the kind she had come to love. Not empty but full of the particular presence of a house that holds people who belong to each other. Cole banked the fire. Eli, who had been managing the evening with the responsible air of someone much older, finished washing the last of the dishes and said goodnight with the particular economy of a boy who has reached the end of a significant day and needs to be alone with it. He paused in the kitchen doorway. "Mom," he said, to Margaret directly, the way he always did now, settled and clear. "Good day." "Good day, Eli," she said. He nodded once and went upstairs. Sadie had fallen asleep on the settee in the front room with her ribbons still in her hair, the way children fall asleep at celebrations, completely and without warning, like a lamp that has run out of oil. Cole lifted her carefully and carried her upstairs, and Margaret heard his footsteps above and the small sound of Sadie being settled and the door closing. When he came back down, the house was fully quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her, the same doorway he had stood in so many evenings over the past months, watching her work, watching the kitchen that had been stripped of life become something else. She was standing at the window, looking out at the dark yard, at the snow-pale ground and the star-bright Wyoming sky, that was the same sky she had stood under on the day she arrived. 11 days of hope collapsed in the dust, an entire town organized against her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "About the step," she said. "The one outside the express office. I think about it sometimes." He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Do you regret any of it?" "Not one day," she said. "Not 1 hour." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled behind them. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, the soft, almost silent snow of a late winter evening in Wyoming, covering the yard and the fence they had fixed together, and the garden that would come back in spring, and the ground that was theirs now, fully and finally, and with the weight of a legal document and a family and 7 months of work behind it. "I need to tell you something," Colt said. "Something I've been carrying since before I walked across that street." She waited. "The day you arrived," he said slowly, "I was standing in front of Whitmore's bank. I'd been in town for supplies. I saw the coach come in. I saw the 3 of them waiting." He paused. "I saw Aldridge walk away, and then Pruitt, and then Cooley." He was looking out the window at the falling snow. "And I stood there and I thought, that's wrong. What's being done to that woman is wrong. And then I thought, and this is the part I've needed to say, I thought I could walk away too. I almost did. I almost told myself it wasn't my concern, that I had enough of my own trouble, that I couldn't take on someone else's difficulty on top of my own." She looked at him. "What made you cross the street?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her. In the kitchen lamplight, his river-colored eyes had the particular quality of sincerity without decoration, the look of a man saying the most accurate, true thing he knows. "You weren't looking for anyone to rescue you," he said. "That was it, I think. Every other person in that situation would have been frightened or angry or desperate. You were doing arithmetic. You were sitting in the middle of something terrible, and you were calculating your next move, and you had your back straight, and you were completely yourself, not performing anything, not asking anything of anyone." He shook his head slightly. "I walked across the street because I wanted to know what a person like that could do with a ranch that needed saving." She looked at him for a long moment. "And?" she said. "And I got considerably more than I bargained for," he said, "in every possible way." She laughed. A real laugh. The full warm kind. The kind that comes from a place in the body that has been gradually unguarding itself over months of mornings and evenings and meals and work and the particular intimacy of fixing a thing together. He laughed too, and it was the same laugh she had heard that first evening on the porch. The surprised one. The one that forgot it was supposed to be reserved. But easier now, more like a thing that lives in him regularly, rather than a thing that escapes him occasionally. When the laughter settled, they stood together at the window while the snow came down outside, and the fire burned behind them. And somewhere above them, two children slept in the rooms that were their rooms, in the house that was their house, on the land that was fully and completely, and with no more threat of anyone taking it, their land. She thought about 11 days in a stagecoach with a stack of letters and $7.30 and a body that the world had spent 28 years deciding was insufficient. She thought about a wooden step, an afternoon dust, and a town arranged like an audience watching her fail. She thought about a kitchen with a missing chair and a boy who wouldn't speak, and a girl who told her the truth about biscuits. She thought about a ledger and a lamp and nights staying awake by a child's bedside and the weight of a promise made and kept. She thought about a legal document, 37 pages long, and a courtroom in a cold building in Rawlins where a judge had looked over his glasses and asked for substance rather than biography. She thought about what you build when you refuse to be built differently by the people who want to make you small. It is not a grand thing, she thought. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive on a particular day or look like what you expected when you were imagining it from a boarding house in Cheyenne. It is the fence you fix together, and the biscuits that taste like warmth, and the plate left empty on the fence post, and the word said in a corridor by a boy who needed to say it more than you needed to hear it. It is 7 months of work, and the way the morning light comes through the kitchen window at an angle, a small girl decided was her favorite thing. It is this. All of this. And it was worth every inch of the journey that brought her here. Outside, the snow fell on the Bennett Ranch, and the valley beyond it, and the town 4 miles south that had laughed at her and needed her, and would not have survived the winter intact without her. The snow fell without preference, on the repaired fences and the sound barn and the kitchen garden waiting under the cold for spring, on the houses of the families who had sat at her kitchen table with their loan documents and their fear and gone home with their land still theirs, on the street where a stagecoach had once stopped and a woman had sat down in the dust and done arithmetic and refused, absolutely refused, to become what anyone expected of her. Cole put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way you lean into something solid and true and yours. And they stood together looking out at the dark and the snow and the enormous quiet of a Wyoming winter night. "Tired?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Good day, though." She smiled. Eli had said it first, upstairs, in his economical way. It was becoming, she realized, a family thing. The kind of small phrase that belongs to a specific group of people and marks them as a group. "Good day," she agreed. "One of the best?" And that was true. And it was also true that there would be more mornings in the kitchen with the particular light, more evenings at the table with the ledger and the lamp, more seasons of this ranch and this family and this valley where a woman had arrived with nothing and built everything. There would be harder days and easier ones, setbacks and repairs, the ordinary, endless work of a life being lived fully. There would be a spring planting and a summer harvest and another winter after that. There would be all of it. She had earned all of it, not by being exceptional, not by being anything other than exactly what she had always been, a woman who paid attention, who did the work, who refused to be made small, who carried her own bag and kept her back straight and did arithmetic in the dust and never, not once, let cruelty change who she was. The woman they laughed at, the woman nobody wanted, the woman now that not one of them could imagine the valley without. She stood at the window in the warmth of her own home and watched the snow fall on her land, and she was content in the way that only the truly earned things make you content, deeply, quietly, permanently. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.